What if I told you that in 1969, one man deliberately disobeyed a direct military order and was rewarded with his nation's highest honor for doing it? I'm talking about a 5-hour ordeal so physically impossible, so morally unambiguous, and so completely ignored by the military establishment that it makes every leadership manual ever written look like fiction. Imagine carrying 40 wounded soldiers through enemy-controlled jungle while an entire North Vietnamese army battalion hunts you. Now imagine doing it alone, without backup, without resupply, and without any realistic chance of survival. That's exactly what Warrant Officer Keith Payne did on May 24th, 1969. But that's not the scandal. The real scandal isn't about the 40 men who lived because one soldier refused to abandon them. It's about the thousands of indigenous fighters who were thrown into impossible situations by a strategy that treated them as expendable assets in a war they never asked to fight. Why did one Australian advisor achieve more in 5 hours than entire American divisions accomplished in 5 years? Why was the lesson buried instead of celebrated? And why, 55 years later, are we still making the same mistakes? Stick with me because in the next 10 minutes, we are going to open the files on the most insane jungle rescue in military history. I'm going to show you the 5 hours that rewrote the rules on moral courage. I'm going to show you why the smallest army in Vietnam embarrassed the largest. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you will never think about following orders the same way again. The jungle was burning. Let's walk into the fire. It was May of 1969, and Ben Het Special Forces Camp sat in the central highlands of South Vietnam like a concrete promise that could not be kept. This was not just another fire base carved out of the hostile landscape. It was a critical node in a chain of border surveillance positions that stretched along the porous frontier with Laos and Cambodia. A supposed tripwire that would detect and disrupt the endless flow of North Vietnamese troops and supplies moving down the Ho Chi Minh Trail toward the populated coastal lowlands. To the American planners in Saigon and Washington, these fortified camps represented the strategic wisdom of placing hard points along the infiltration corridors, creating islands of strength that would anchor the defense of the entire Central Highlands. The logic was seductive in its simplicity. If you built the walls thick enough and stationed enough firepower behind the wire, you could create zones of absolute control in the middle of enemy territory, transforming the unpredictable chaos of guerrilla warfare into a manageable exercise in holding ground. They were trying to impose order on a landscape that had been consuming invaders for thousands of years, convinced that American engineering and South Vietnamese determination could succeed where the French had catastrophically failed just 15 years earlier. Ben Het's position near the tri-border area made it simultaneously vital and vulnerable. The camp guarded approaches from communist sanctuaries in Laos, where entire North Vietnamese divisions could rest, rearm, and plan operations without fear of ground assault, protected by the political fiction that made cross-border operations diplomatically impossible for most American units. From those safe havens, the enemy could concentrate forces, launch coordinated attacks, and then melt back across imaginary lines that meant everything to politicians in Washington and absolutely nothing to soldiers bleeding in the jungle. The camp was supposed to be the cork in the bottle, the obstacle that forced the enemy to reveal himself. But in reality, Ben Het and positions like it were more like bait, isolated outposts surrounded by an ocean of hostile territory that the enemy could flood at any moment with overwhelming force. The strategic calculation assumed that American air power and artillery could compensate for the geographic isolation. that helicopter gunships and fighter bombers could arrive in time to save any position that came under serious attack. It was a gamble that ignored the fundamental reality of terrain, weather, and an enemy who had spent decades learning exactly how to fight a war where the other side controlled the skies. This was the spring of 1969, a pivot point in a war that was simultaneously escalating and contracting. Richard Nixon had been inaugurated just 4 months earlier, bringing with him a policy called Vietnamization that promised to transfer combat responsibility from American forces to their South Vietnamese allies, while gradually withdrawing United States troops. The strategy depended on a critical assumption that South Vietnamese units, properly advised and equipped, could hold the line against the North Vietnamese army without the overwhelming American military presence that had been the backbone of the war effort since 1965. It was a beautiful theory that looked magnificent on briefing charts and sounded responsible in press conferences. But it had one fatal flaw. The South Vietnamese military was riddled with corruption, plagued by poor leadership, and fundamentally lacking in unit cohesion that makes soldiers willing to die for each other. Vietnamization was asking troops who didn't trust their officers and didn't believe in their government to stand firm against one of the most experienced and motivated armies in the world. To make this impossible equation work, the Americans relied on a secret weapon that never appeared in the glossy publicity materials about the policy. They relied on advisors, but not all advisors were created equal. While the United States had thousands of officers and senior enlisted personnel serving in advisory roles throughout South Vietnam, embedded at every level from division headquarters down to district militia units, there was one advisory organization that operated on a completely different plane of excellence. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam was so small that most Americans in country had never heard of it. A maximum strength of just 100 to 120 volunteers, drawn from the elite units of the Australian Army. These were not fresh lieutenants learning on the job or career officers punching tickets on their way to higher rank. The AATTV recruited warrant officers and senior non-commissioned officers with years of combat experience, men who had already proven themselves in the jungles of Malaya or the training grounds of Australia's Special Operations Community. They were inserted at the sharp end of the war, embedded with South Vietnamese and indigenous units that operated in the most dangerous territory along the borders and in the contested highlands. Their mission was simple to describe and nearly impossible to execute. Make these units effective enough to survive contact with the enemy without the massive American firepower umbrella that made most South Vietnamese operations possible. The team was so effective and took such horrific casualties that it would eventually become the most highly decorated Australian unit per capita in the nation's military history. 4 members would receive the Victoria Cross, Australia's highest award for valor, a decoration so rarely given that receiving it automatically made you one of the most famous soldiers in the country. For a unit that never exceeded 120 personnel, 4 Victoria Crosses was a statistical impossibility that spoke volumes about the fighting they were doing and the men who volunteered for it. The casualty rate approached 50% over the course of the war. Half of the men who served with the team would be killed or wounded, a butcher's bill that would be considered unsustainable for any conventional unit. But the AATTV wasn't asking for sustainment. They were asking for results. And results were measured in whether the indigenous and South Vietnamese soldiers they advised would stand and fight when the shooting started, or whether they would collapse and run like so many units did when the advisors weren't there to stiffen their spines. The Australian approach to advising was fundamentally different from the American model, and the difference would prove critical when the moment of truth arrived. American advisors often maintained a professional distance from the troops they were supposed to guide, living in separate compounds, eating better food, enjoying privileges that highlighted the gap between the wealthy foreigners and the local soldiers who were doing most of the dying. The Australians embedded completely. They ate the same rations, slept in the same primitive conditions, and shared every hardship with the men they advised. They led from the front during operations, deliberately exposing themselves to the same dangers as the soldiers they were trying to inspire. This wasn't altruism or democratic sentiment. It was cold, tactical calculation. The AATTV had learned in Malaya and Borneo that indigenous soldiers would only follow advisors they respected, and respect in infantry combat is earned in blood and sweat, not granted through rank or nationality. If you wanted Montagnard soldiers to trust you with their lives, you had to prove you were willing to risk yours for them. It was a simple equation that required a specific type of soldier to execute. And that's why the selection process for the team was brutally demanding. 300 miles to the south, the contrast between the massive American approach and the lean Australian method was even more stark. While the United States was maintaining base complexes that resembled small industrial cities, complete with air-conditioned offices, paved roads, and amenities that would have been luxuries back home, the Australians were operating out of primitive camps where comfort was measured by whether you had a dry place to sleep and hot food once a day. The Americans measured their strength in tons of supplies delivered, sorties flown, and artillery rounds expended. The Australians measured theirs in intelligence gathered, enemy positions identified, and successful ambushes conducted with minimal expenditure of ammunition. One side was fighting an industrial war of attrition. The other was fighting a war of precision. And the hunters were winning their battles at a fraction of the cost, while the industrial machine was consuming billions of dollars and achieving results that looked impressive in statistics, but meant nothing on the actual battlefield. Warrant Officer Keith Payne was a perfect exemplar of the Australian approach. A man whose entire career had been preparation for the war the AATTV was fighting. Born in 1933 in Ingham, Queensland, a small town in the tropical north where toughness was a basic requirement for survival, Payne had enlisted in the Australian Army in 1951 during the Korean War. He was 18 years old and looking for something more challenging than cutting sugarcane in the Queensland heat. The Army had given him exactly what he was looking for: a life of physical hardship, clear purpose, and the satisfaction of being genuinely excellent at something that mattered. By 1969, he had 18 years of service behind him, including combat experience in Korea and extensive jungle warfare operations during the Malayan Emergency, where British and Commonwealth forces had spent more than a decade hunting communist insurgents through terrain that made Vietnam look hospitable by comparison. Payne had learned his craft in a war where victory came from patient stalking, perfect ambushes, and the ability to move through the jungle as quietly as the enemy you were hunting. His rank of Warrant Officer Class 2 placed him in that unique tier of the military hierarchy where technical expertise and tactical competence mattered more than staff work or political maneuvering. A WO2 was typically the senior non-commissioned officer in a company-sized unit, the man responsible for training, discipline, and making sure that whatever brilliant plan the officers had conceived could actually be executed by soldiers carrying 70 pounds of equipment through mud and heat. Payne had a reputation for being physically harder than men half his age, maintaining fitness standards that made younger soldiers wince. His leadership style was blunt and uncompromising. He didn't believe in motivational speeches or appeals to abstract patriotism. He believed in leading by example, in being the first man through the door and the last man out, in never asking soldiers to do anything he wouldn't do himself. This approach earned him deep respect from the men under his command and occasional friction with officers who preferred a more diplomatic touch. Payne didn't care about being diplomatic. He cared about keeping soldiers alive and completing the mission in that order. When he volunteered for service with the AATTV in 1969, Payne was assigned as an advisor to the 212th Battalion of the 1st Mobile Strike Force, a unit that existed in the complicated gray zone between conventional military formation and tribal militia. The battalion was composed primarily of Montagnard soldiers, the indigenous Highland people who had inhabited the Central Highlands for centuries before the Vietnamese arrived and who maintained a fierce independence from both the Communist North and the Saigon government in the South. The French had called them Montagnards, mountain people, a name that stuck even though the various tribes had their own languages and identities. They were Jarai, Banar, and Sedang peoples with distinct cultures and a shared history of being marginalized by the lowland Vietnamese, who viewed them as primitive savages. Both sides in the war courted the Montagnards because they were superb jungle fighters who knew every trail and stream in the highlands, and because controlling the highlands meant controlling the infiltration routes that were the lifeblood of the communist war effort. The Montagnards, who served in units like the 212th Battalion, had their own reasons for fighting, and those reasons had very little to do with the ideological struggle between communism and democracy that obsessed the Americans and Vietnamese. They fought because their villages were in the contested zones where both sides operated. They fought because the Saigon government had broken every promise ever made to them about autonomy and respect. They fought because the communists would conscript their young men and commandeer their crops if given the chance. And most importantly, they fought for the individual advisors they trusted, men like Keith Payne, who treated them as soldiers rather than expendable native auxiliaries. This personal loyalty would prove critical when the world fell apart, because Montagnard soldiers would do things for advisors they respected that they would never do for Vietnamese officers they despised. But that loyalty only extended as far as the advisor was willing to go. If the advisor ran when things got bad, the Montagnards would remember forever. If he stood when everyone else fled, they would follow him into hell. The 212th Battalion was organized along the lines of the Civilian Irregular Defense Group program, an American Special Forces initiative that recruited and trained indigenous fighters for border surveillance and local security missions. On paper, the battalion had between 500 and 700 soldiers, organized into companies with a mix of light infantry weapons, including M16 rifles, M60 machine guns, and M79 grenade launchers. In practice, combat effectiveness varied wildly depending on leadership, recent casualties, and whether the soldiers believed their mission made sense. Unlike regular South Vietnamese Army units, many CIDG formations included the families of the fighters, who lived in compounds near the operational areas and provided a powerful motivation for the soldiers to defend their positions. You fought harder when your wife and children were a few hundred meters behind you. But it also meant that catastrophic defeat didn't just cost military casualties, it cost entire communities. The battalion's equipment was adequate for defensive operations and small unit patrols, but woefully insufficient for major combat that the North Vietnamese Army was increasingly willing to initiate. The Montagnards had no armor, no significant artillery, and no ability to call in the massive American air support that made conventional ARVN units feel invincible. Their communications equipment was basic and frequently unreliable in the dense jungle terrain. Their medical support was primitive, meaning that wounds that would be survivable with rapid evacuation often proved fatal when the nearest surgical hospital was an hour away by helicopter, assuming the weather allowed helicopters to fly at all. They were light infantry in the purest sense, dependent on their fieldcraft, their knowledge of the terrain, and the leadership of men like Keith Payne to survive against an enemy that was increasingly willing to bring heavy weapons to the fight. While Keith Payne was building trust with his Montagnard soldiers through shared patrols and deliberate, patient leadership that earns respect one day at a time, a completely different set of calculations was being made in command bunkers on the other side of the border. The North Vietnamese Army had spent the first years of large-scale American involvement learning painful lessons about what happened when you fought the enemy's strength. Human wave attacks against positions defended by overwhelming firepower had filled cemeteries without achieving strategic objectives. Stand-up battles against American mechanized units had demonstrated that courage and revolutionary zeal could not overcome tactical air support and artillery that could devastate square kilometers of jungle in minutes. But the North Vietnamese were not ideological fanatics blindly throwing lives away. They were professional soldiers who studied their defeats, adapted their tactics, and waited patiently for opportunities to fight on terms that favored their strengths rather than American advantages. By 1969, that adaptation was taking a new and ominous form. The NVA had begun employing conventional combined arms tactics in situations where they judged the correlation of forces to be in their favor, using artillery preparation, armored vehicles, and coordinated infantry assaults that looked more like Soviet doctrine than guerrilla warfare. The appearance of PT-76 light tanks in the Central Highlands had shocked American intelligence analysts, who had assumed the terrain made armor employment impossible. The tanks weren't particularly impressive by modern standards. Lightly armored amphibious vehicles with 76mm guns that would be death traps against American armor. But against Montagnard infantry positions defended by rifles and machine guns, a tank was a rolling nightmare that could shrug off small arms fire and systematically destroy defensive positions with impunity. The psychological impact was even more significant than the tactical advantage. Soldiers who had never seen armor before, who had no anti-tank weapons beyond a few RPG-7s of dubious reliability, faced an enemy that seemed invincible. The North Vietnamese strategy for the Central Highlands was methodical and patient, exactly the approach that long-term revolutionaries who measured their campaigns in decades rather than quarterly reports could sustain indefinitely. They would identify isolated positions like Ben Het, concentrate overwhelming force from sanctuaries the Americans couldn't legally attack, launch coordinated assaults designed to overwhelm the defenders, and then withdraw before American air power could be brought to bear in sufficient strength to turn the tactical situation against them. The goal wasn't to hold ground in the conventional sense. It was to bleed the South Vietnamese forces, demonstrate that Vietnamization was a fantasy, and make the American public question whether propping up the Saigon government was worth the cost in lives and treasure. Every successful assault on a border camp, every unit of Montagnard soldiers destroyed, every American advisor killed or captured, advanced that strategic objective. The NVA didn't need to win battles in the traditional sense. They just needed to make the war unwinnable for the other side. In late May of 1969, the North Vietnamese judged that Ben Het was ripe for assault. Intelligence indicated that the main camp was defended, but the outlying positions held by CIDG units like the 212th Battalion were vulnerable to the massed infantry attack that the NVA excelled at executing. The plan was textbook Soviet combined arms doctrine adapted for jungle warfare. Artillery preparation to disrupt communications and demoralize defenders, followed by coordinated infantry assault from multiple directions to prevent the defenders from concentrating their forces, with the objective of overrunning positions before American air support could be effectively employed. The NVA commanders knew that weather and terrain often prevented American aircraft from operating, that there was a gap between when an attack commenced and when jet fighters could arrive overhead, and that gap was when battles were won or lost. If they could hit hard enough and fast enough, they could destroy the defending units and withdraw before the massive American firepower advantage could be brought to bear. The soldiers of the 212th Battalion had no way of knowing that they had been selected as a target for annihilation. Intelligence about enemy intentions in the border areas was always fragmentary, a puzzle assembled from radio intercepts, agent reports, and the tracks that scouts found on jungle trails. Sometimes you got warning that something big was coming. Sometimes the first indication that the enemy was preparing an offensive was the moment artillery rounds started falling on your position. The Montagnard soldiers had been through combat before. They knew that their location made them vulnerable. They knew that the concrete and firepower of the main American compound at Ben Het offered a security that their more exposed positions could never match. But they also knew that this was the mission. Hold the forward positions, sound the alarm if a major attack developed, and trust that the advisors and the massive American military machine would intervene before things became catastrophic. It was a faith that was about to be tested beyond its breaking point. At approximately 2200 hours on the night of May 24th, 1969, the world ended for the soldiers of the 212th Battalion. The first indication that something was catastrophically wrong came not from early warning systems or forward observers, but from the sudden appearance of explosions that turned night into day and earth into a liquid shaker. The North Vietnamese artillery barrage was not a few ranging shots or a brief preparation. It was a sustained bombardment using 122mm rockets and 82mm mortars, weapons that created kill zones measured in dozens of meters and could collapse bunkers that hadn't been built to proper specifications. The psychological effect of a major artillery barrage is difficult to convey to anyone who has not experienced it. The sound is not just loud, it's a physical pressure that you feel in your chest and skull, a pounding that disorients and terrifies even experienced soldiers. The explosions create a chaotic sensory environment where communication becomes impossible, where the blast overpressure from near misses can leave you disoriented and bleeding from the nose and ears, where the only thing that matters is finding cover and praying that the next round doesn't land in your hole. The barrage lasted long enough to shred the defensive wire, destroy communications equipment, and create a state of shock among the defenders that would make organized resistance difficult when the ground assault came. And the ground assault came with a speed and coordination that spoke to careful rehearsal and professional execution. North Vietnamese infantry penetrated the defensive perimeter in multiple locations simultaneously, using darkness and the chaos created by the artillery to close with the Montagnard positions before effective defensive fires could be organized. In the darkness and confusion, with communications down and leadership fragmented, the defense collapsed from a coordinated effort into isolated pockets of soldiers fighting for their lives without any clear picture of what was happening around them. Some bunkers held, their occupants laying down fire that forced the attackers to bypass and isolate them. Other positions were overrun in brutal close quarters, fighting where the advantage went to whoever fired first or was more willing to close to hand-to-hand range. Keith Payne was in the middle of this disintegrating nightmare, trying to rally Montagnard soldiers who were being killed and scattered by an assault that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He could see North Vietnamese soldiers moving through positions that should have been held by his own troops. He could hear the distinctive crack of AK-47 fire mixing with the heavier sound of M60s, telling him that at least some of the defensive positions were still fighting. But he could also hear something that was far more ominous than the sounds of combat. The absence of coordinated fire, the silence from sectors where there should have been resistance, the spreading realization that the position was being overrun and that organized defense had become individual survival. The Montagnard soldiers were not cowards. Many of them fought with desperate courage, holding positions until they were killed or until ammunition ran out. But courage without support and coordination is just a recipe for dying in place, and the soldiers who survived the initial assault were the ones who fell back into the jungle, sometimes in small groups, sometimes as individuals who had lost contact with their units entirely. As dawn began to break over the Central Highlands, revealing the full extent of the disaster, the landscape around the former 212th Battalion position looked like a vision of hell rendered in mud and blood. Bodies were scattered throughout the defensive perimeter, some clearly killed by the artillery barrage, others fallen in the close quarters fighting that had followed. Equipment was strewn everywhere, weapons dropped by soldiers who had fled or who no longer needed them. The wounded were hidden in the jungle undergrowth, some barely conscious from blood loss or shock, others fully aware and terrified that the North Vietnamese would find them before friendly forces could mount a rescue. The NVA were conducting systematic cleanup operations, moving methodically through the area to finish off resistance, recover usable equipment, and ensure that no pockets of organized defense remained that could threaten their control of the captured ground. For the wounded Montagnard soldiers hiding in the jungle, death was not a possibility but a certainty unless something changed very quickly. It was at this moment, with the battle technically over and the survivors scattered through hostile territory, that Keith Payne received the order that should have ended his role in the disaster. Australian Command, monitoring the situation from their operational headquarters and in contact with American units at Ben Het, directed all advisors to withdraw to the main compound. The order made perfect military sense from every conventional perspective. The position had fallen, the unit had been destroyed as a cohesive fighting force. The advisors were valuable assets whose loss would cripple the advisory effort across multiple units. Staying in the area meant almost certain death or capture, and neither outcome would change the tactical reality that the 212th Battalion no longer existed as a military formation. The smart move, the rational calculation that weighed risks against benefits, was to get out while escape was still possible and preserve the advisors to fight another day with other units. Most of the Australian advisors with other units in the Ben Het area received the order and complied, making their way back to the relative safety of the main compound through jungle trails and terrain that they knew well enough to avoid the worst of the NVA presence. Keith Payne acknowledged the order. He understood the military logic behind it. He recognized that staying meant he would probably die accomplishing nothing that would matter in the broader tactical picture. And then he made a choice that defied every rational calculation, every bit of military common sense, and every survival instinct that 18 years of combat service had burned into his nervous system. He refused to leave, not in a dramatic declaration of defiance, not in an emotional outburst about honor and loyalty, but with the quiet stubbornness of a man who had determined what he was going to be and was not interested in debating the point. He had approximately 40 Montagnard soldiers scattered through the jungle, many of them wounded, all of them in danger of being hunted down and killed by NVA cleanup teams. Those soldiers were his responsibility, not in an abstract administrative sense, but in the most fundamental human sense. They had trusted him, they had fought under his leadership, and Keith Payne had apparently decided at some point in his life that abandoning wounded soldiers to save his own skin was not acceptable. The choice to stay was not a tactical calculation about mission accomplishment or strategic importance. It was a moral judgment about behavior that defines you as a human being when the stakes are life and death, and no one is watching to judge whether you do the right thing. The Montagnard soldiers hiding in the jungle would know. Payne would know. And apparently, that was enough audience for him to care about the verdict. There is courage that shows up when the cameras are rolling and the medals committee is watching. Courage that involves grand gestures and dramatic moments that make for good stories. And then there is courage that operates in complete obscurity, where the only reward for doing the right thing is that you get to live with yourself afterward, assuming you live at all. Keith Payne's choice fell into the second category. No one would have blamed him for following orders. His career would have been fine. He would have been back at base with a hot meal and safety that the soldiers he left behind would never experience again. But he would have had to live for the next 50 years, knowing that he chose his own life over the lives of soldiers who had trusted him. And apparently, that was a price he was not willing to pay. As the sun climbed higher over the Central Highlands and the temperature began its daily climb toward oppressive, Payne started the work that would define him for the rest of his life. The jungle around the former defensive position was dense, triple canopy rainforest, where visibility was measured in meters and navigation was an exercise in dead reckoning and instinct. Finding wounded soldiers in this environment, when you didn't know exactly where they were hiding, was like searching for specific grains of sand on a beach. Except the beach was trying to kill you, and the grains of sand were trying not to be found by anyone, friendly or enemy. Payne had advantages that made the task merely nearly impossible rather than completely impossible. He knew the terrain from patrols and operations over the previous weeks. He knew his soldiers well enough to predict where they might go if they were injured and trying to hide. He knew the patterns of vegetation and drainage that created natural hiding spots where a wounded man might take cover. And he knew that time was his enemy in multiple ways. The NVA were actively hunting. Survivors, the wounded, were deteriorating from blood loss and shock, and his own physical reserves were finite. The first wounded soldier Payne found was hiding in dense undergrowth at the base of a ridgeline, partially concealed by fallen logs and tangled vegetation. The man was conscious but badly injured, hit by shrapnel from the artillery barrage that had opened the battle. He was terrified, having spent hours listening to North Vietnamese soldiers moving through the area, expecting every moment to be discovered and killed. When Payne appeared through the vegetation, the relief on the soldier's face was so intense it was almost painful to witness. Payne did a rapid assessment of the wounds, determined that the man could not walk on his own, and made the first of many choices that would push the boundaries of human endurance. He would carry the wounded soldier to a consolidation point where he could gather other survivors, then go back for more. The alternative was to leave the man and search for others first, but Payne had already decided that he was not leaving anyone if there was any possibility of rescue. The mathematical logic that said you should search for all the wounded first and then figure out how to move them was fine in a classroom. In the jungle with the enemy hunting you, the right answer was to get soldiers to safety as you found them, because if you left them to search for others, the NVA might find them first. Carrying a full-grown man through dense jungle is not like carrying a backpack or even like carrying equipment. A wounded soldier is awkward weight that shifts and drags, catching on vegetation, throwing off your balance on uneven terrain, and requiring constant adjustment to maintain anything like efficient movement. Payne was 35 years old and exceptionally fit by the standards of elite soldiers, but what he was attempting would have challenged men half his age and twice his size. The temperature was climbing past 90 degrees Fahrenheit with humidity that made the air feel thick and difficult to breathe. Every step required pushing through vegetation, testing uncertain footing, and maintaining enough awareness of his surroundings to avoid stumbling into an NVA patrol. His uniform was soaked with sweat within minutes. His shoulders and back were screaming from the weight and the awkward distribution of load. And he had miles to go and dozens more soldiers to find if he was going to make good on the promise he had made to himself about not abandoning his men. The consolidation point Payne selected was a small depression in the terrain with good cover and concealment, far enough from the main battle area that it was unlikely to be in the path of NVA patrols, but close enough that he could make multiple trips without covering impossible distances. He positioned the first wounded soldier in a spot where he would be hidden from casual observation, made sure the man understood to stay quiet no matter what happened, and then turned around and walked back into the jungle to search for more survivors. This pattern would repeat throughout the morning with a monotony that was physically agonizing and psychologically surreal. Find a wounded soldier or a small group of survivors. Assess their condition. Either help them to the consolidation point if they could walk with support, or carry them on his back if they could not. Return to the search area. Find more soldiers. Repeat the process. Each trip was a separate lifetime of physical effort and mortal danger, compressed into the span of minutes or hours that blurred together in the heat and exhaustion. The North Vietnamese were not sitting idle during this process. They were conducting their own systematic search of the area, looking for survivors to kill, weapons to recover, and any intelligence materials that might be useful. The fact that Payne was operating in the same space without being detected or engaged speaks to a combination of luck, exceptional fieldcraft, and situational awareness that comes from years of experience moving through hostile jungle. He used terrain features to mask his movement, avoided open areas where he might be silhouetted against vegetation, and most critically, maintained absolute noise discipline, moving slowly enough that he didn't create the sounds of crashing through undergrowth that would alert enemy soldiers to his presence. There were multiple instances where he could hear North Vietnamese soldiers close enough that he could have engaged them if he chose to reveal his position. But engaging meant giving up the mission. Every shot fired was a beacon that would draw more enemy troops to his location, ending any chance of continuing the rescue operation. So he hid, waited for the enemy to pass, and then continued his methodical search for survivors. By approximately 0800 hours, Payne had found and consolidated 8 to 10 soldiers, a mix of wounded who needed carrying and less seriously injured men who could walk with support. It was a significant accomplishment that would have been a successful operation by any reasonable standard. But Payne knew there were more wounded still out in the jungle, and he had not yet reached the point where the physical cost of continuing outweighed the moral imperative to keep searching. He could feel his body beginning to break down in ways that were concerning, but not yet debilitating. His water was running low, and there was no possibility of resupply. His ammunition expenditure had been minimal because he had avoided contact. But the rifles and grenades he carried were limited by what he could physically transport while also carrying wounded soldiers. Most critically, he could sense the NVA presence intensifying as they expanded their search pattern, which meant that the window of opportunity for rescue operations was closing with every passing minute. But there were still soldiers out there, still men who had trusted him and who would die if he stopped searching. So he went back. The third and fourth trips were harder than the first two, not because the terrain was more difficult or the soldiers were farther away, but because Payne's body was beginning to exhaust reserves that evolution never intended to be drained this completely. The human body is capable of extraordinary things when adrenaline and will override the normal safety mechanisms that prevent you from damaging yourself through extreme exertion. But those safety mechanisms exist for good reasons, and ignoring them comes at a cost that has to be paid eventually. Payne's legs were trembling from the sustained effort of carrying heavy loads over rough terrain. His shoulders were raw from the chafing of wet fabric and the pressure of supporting wounded soldiers. His lungs were burning from breathing air that felt more like hot soup than atmosphere. And yet he kept moving, one step at a time, because stopping meant accepting that some number of his soldiers would die, and he had determined that was not acceptable as long as he could still put one foot in front of the other. The psychological state required to sustain this effort is difficult to understand for anyone who has not experienced sustained physical extremity in life-threatening circumstances. Payne was operating in a space where rational calculation had been replaced by a simple loop. Find soldiers, move soldiers to safety, go back for more. There was no complex thinking, no weighing of options or consideration of alternatives. The choice had been made hours ago. Now it was just execution, grinding forward through exhaustion and danger, because stopping meant failure, and failure meant dead soldiers. Some of the Montagnard soldiers he rescued later described watching him return for yet another trip and being unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. In their culture, leaders were expected to be brave and to share the dangers of their men. But what Payne was doing went beyond cultural expectations into something that looked like madness or divine possession. A man who had been given permission to leave, who had every rational reason to prioritize his own survival, was instead choosing to make repeated trips into enemy-controlled jungle to carry wounded soldiers to safety. The cognitive dissonance between what military training and common sense suggested should happen and what they were actually witnessing created a kind of awe that would translate into stories that would be told and retold long after the war ended. By approximately 0930 hours, Payne had consolidated somewhere between 20 and 30 soldiers, a number that was growing beyond his ability to easily manage or defend if the North Vietnamese found the group. He was facing a dilemma that had been building with each successful rescue. At what point did the size of the group become a liability that made further rescues impossible? A small group could move relatively quietly and could hide effectively. A group of 30 or 40 people, many of them wounded, was a different tactical problem entirely. They could be heard from much farther away. They required significantly more space to hide effectively, and defending them against a determined NVA assault with his limited ammunition would be impossible. But there were still more wounded soldiers out in the jungle. Payne could hear some of them, faint calls for help that had to be answered or ignored. Rational tactical thinking said he needed to stop searching and focus on getting the soldiers he had already found back to friendly lines. The part of his brain that was still functioning on something other than pure stubborn will said that continuing meant risking not just his own life, but the lives of everyone he had already rescued. And yet, he kept going back. The 5th and 6th trips achieved a kind of transcendence, where physical agony became background noise, and the world narrowed to the immediate task of moving through jungle, finding wounded soldiers, and carrying them to safety. Payne was operating on fumes, his body consuming reserves that would require days or weeks to replenish, assuming he survived long enough for recovery to matter. His movements were slower, less efficient, marked by visible strain that indicates a human machine pushed far past its design limitations. The Montagnard soldiers who were less seriously wounded and could observe his condition were torn between admiration and horror at what they were witnessing. Some tried to convince him to stop, to focus on getting the group out rather than continuing to search. Payne ignored them with single-minded focus that brooks no argument. He had apparently decided that he would search until either he found all the wounded or his body physically gave out, and mere exhaustion was not going to be the limiting factor as long as he could still move. There was a moment, sometime around 1000 hours, when the mathematical impossibility of what Payne was accomplishing became almost darkly comic. He was one man. He had been operating continuously for 5 to 6 hours in tropical heat while carrying wounded soldiers over rough terrain. He had covered miles of jungle, much of it repeatedly. He had avoided detection by an enemy force that was actively hunting for survivors. He had found and consolidated approximately 35 to 40 soldiers, many of them seriously wounded, and moved them to a position of relative safety. The caloric expenditure alone was beyond what the human body should be capable of sustaining. The psychological stress of constant mortal danger should have triggered survival instincts that would compel retreat. The physical pain of overused muscles and joints should have forced rest periods that would have made the operation take twice as long, if it was possible at all. And yet Payne was still moving, still searching, still carrying wounded soldiers through the jungle, as if sheer bloody-minded determination could rewrite the laws of human physiology. The North Vietnamese had thousands of soldiers hunting for one Australian warrant officer and a group of indigenous fighters. The one Australian warrant officer was winning, but even Keith Payne had limits, and by approximately 1030 to 1100 hours, those limits were making themselves felt in ways that could not be ignored. His consolidation point now held somewhere between 35 and 45 soldiers, the exact number unclear because of the chaos and because some wounded were barely conscious and not easily counted. The group was too large to hide effectively. The NVA were closing in, their search pattern tightening around the area where Payne had been operating. Most critically, Payne's ability to make additional trips was reaching the point where he would physically collapse before finding more wounded, which meant that continuing the search would likely result in his death without accomplishing additional rescues. It was time to transition from rescue operations to escape and evasion, to take the soldiers he had saved and attempt to get them through several kilometers of enemy-controlled jungle back to the relative safety of the Ben Het compound. This would require organizing 40-plus exhausted, frightened, wounded soldiers into a formation capable of moving tactically through hostile territory without being detected or destroyed. Under normal circumstances, this would be a task for a platoon of experienced infantry with proper communications and support. Payne would be doing it alone, with indigenous soldiers who had just survived the worst experience of their lives and who had every reason to panic at the first sign of additional enemy contact. The organization of the withdrawal column demonstrated why the Australian Army had selected Keith Payne for advisory duty in the first place. Despite his exhaustion and the desperate circumstances, he conducted the planning and organization with the methodical professionalism of a peacetime training exercise. He positioned the least wounded soldiers at the front and rear of the column as scouts and security, telling them their job was to watch for enemy movement and give warning if they were about to walk into an ambush. The seriously wounded were distributed throughout the middle of the column, supported by other soldiers who could help them move. Payne positioned himself where he could see most of the column and could move to the front or rear as the tactical situation required. He established simple hand signals for communication, since voice communication would give away their position. And he made absolutely clear to everyone that noise discipline was the difference between survival and annihilation. If they could move quietly enough and choose their route carefully enough, they might be able to slip through the NVA positions without being detected. If they were spotted, the size of the group and the condition of the wounded meant that a fight would likely end in massacre. The march back toward Ben Het began sometime around 1100 to 1130 hours and would take 3 to 4 hours of painstaking movement through some of the most dangerous terrain Payne had ever traversed. The distance in a straight line was only a few kilometers, a march that a fit infantry platoon could complete in less than an hour. But a straight line meant crossing open areas and following obvious routes that the enemy would be watching. Instead, Payne chose a route that used terrain features and vegetation for concealment, accepting the longer distance and difficult terrain as the price of survival. They moved at a pace that was agonizingly slow, sometimes covering less than a few hundred meters in an hour, stopping frequently to listen for enemy movement and to allow wounded soldiers who were at the edge of collapse to rest briefly before continuing. Every meter of progress required Payne to make tactical choices about route selection based on incomplete information and exhausted judgment. Multiple times during the march, they were forced to either hide from North Vietnamese patrols that crossed their path or to carefully navigate around enemy positions that blocked their route. These encounters were exercises in nerve control, where the entire group had to freeze and remain absolutely silent while enemy soldiers moved close enough that individual voices and equipment sounds were clearly audible. The wounded soldiers who were in severe pain had to suppress groans and cries that would have given away the group's position. The Montagnards who had families in the compounds near Ben Het and who knew that those families might have been caught in the attack had to control their fear and impatience and trust that Payne knew what he was doing. And Payne himself had to function on judgment and instinct that were being degraded by exhaustion and dehydration to the point where thinking was becoming difficult. But the group held together, moving with disciplined silence that comes from understanding that your life depends on the soldier next to you doing their job correctly. There was at least one significant engagement during the withdrawal, when the column encountered a North Vietnamese blocking position that could not be avoided or bypassed. The details of this fight are obscured by the fog of war and the chaos of the moment. But it involved Payne and the able-bodied Montagnards conducting a brief, violent assault to break through the enemy position while minimizing casualties to their own wounded. This was not a set-piece battle with careful planning and supporting fires. It was a desperate, chaotic brawl where victory went to whoever could bring overwhelming violence to bear first and then disengage before enemy reinforcements arrived. Payne employed the basic infantry tactic of fire and maneuver, having some soldiers lay down suppressive fire while others closed with the enemy position using grenades and rifles at close range. The Montagnards fought with ferocity that comes from having nothing to lose and everything at stake. The NVA soldiers holding the position were likely as surprised and disorganized as the attacking group. Caught off guard by what they probably expected to be frightened survivors rather than an organized fighting force, the engagement lasted minutes rather than hours, ending when the enemy position was overrun or suppressed enough that the column could push through and continue their movement toward friendly lines. The cost of the engagement was paid in ammunition that Payne could not afford to expend and in additional casualties among soldiers who were already at the breaking point. Some of the wounded who had been rescued during the morning did not survive the march, succumbing to their injuries despite Payne's efforts. Each death was a small failure within the larger success, a reminder that even superhuman effort cannot overcome certain wounds or buy back time that has already been lost. But the group kept moving because stopping meant dying for everyone, and the soldiers who had survived this far were not about to give up when safety was possibly within reach. As the Ben Het compound finally came into view through gaps in the jungle canopy, Payne faced one final absurdity that perfectly captured the insanity of war. After 5+ hours of evading the enemy, avoiding detection, and fighting when necessary, he now had to worry about being shot by nervous American defenders who might not recognize a mixed group of Australians and Montagnards emerging from the jungle as friendly forces. The possibility of being killed by friendly fire after everything they had survived was so ridiculous that it would have been funny if the danger had not been genuine. Payne established communication with the compound using a combination of radio calls and visual signals, identifying his group and requesting permission to enter the perimeter. The defenders, who had been expecting the worst after the reports of the 212th Battalion's destruction, were stunned to see what appeared to be a sizable group of survivors approaching the wire. When they realized that an Australian advisor had just walked approximately 40 soldiers through enemy-controlled territory, the reaction was a mixture of disbelief and something approaching awe. The entry into the compound was not a triumphant moment of celebration, but rather a quiet collapse into safety that felt almost anticlimactic after the sustained intensity of the previous hours. Payne organized the handoff of wounded soldiers to medical personnel, conducted a rapid head count to confirm how many soldiers he had brought back, and then made his way to a bunker where he could report to his chain of command. And then, having sustained himself through sheer will and adrenaline for hours beyond the point where normal humans would have collapsed, Keith Payne's body finally acknowledged that it had been operating in an unsustainable state. He collapsed from a combination of dehydration, exhaustion, and the sudden removal of the life-or-death imperative that had been keeping him upright. Medical personnel who examined him found a man who had pushed himself to the very edge of what human physiology could tolerate. Someone who should have been hospitalized for days rather than hours. But Payne was conscious, coherent, and according to later accounts, primarily concerned with making sure that all the wounded Montagnards were receiving proper medical treatment and that someone was organizing efforts to account for soldiers who had not made it back. The aftermath of May 24, 1969, required a grim accounting that highlighted just how catastrophic the North Vietnamese assault on the 212th Battalion had been. The unit had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force, with casualties estimated between 100 and 200 soldiers killed during the initial assault and in the chaotic fighting that followed. The exact numbers would never be precisely determined because of the nature of the battle, the incomplete records of indigenous units, and the difficulty of distinguishing between soldiers who were killed, captured, or who simply disappeared into the jungle and never returned. Some families would wait weeks or months for word of soldiers who would never come home, trapped in the terrible limbo between hope and acceptance that is one of war's cruelest features. The surviving soldiers, those who had managed to escape the initial assault and avoid capture during the NVA's cleanup operations, were scattered throughout the area and would filter back to friendly lines over the next days in small groups or as individuals. But the core of the battalion, the soldiers who had formed its experienced leadership and cohesion, was gone. Keith Payne's rescue of approximately 40 soldiers represented a significant portion of the battalion's survivors, a fact that would become important when the military bureaucracy attempted to process what had happened and determine what consequences should follow from a warrant officer choosing to disobey a direct order. But in the immediate aftermath, Payne was dealing with survivors' guilt, physical exhaustion, and anger at a strategic situation that had put indigenous soldiers in an impossible position and then left them to die when the inevitable disaster occurred. The Montagnard soldiers he had rescued were dealing with their own complex emotions: grief for lost comrades, trauma from the battle, and a kind of reverence toward the Australian advisor who had refused to abandon them. In Montagnard culture, a leader who shared the dangers of his men and who fought to protect them, even at the cost of his own safety, earned loyalty that went beyond military discipline or contractual obligation. What Payne had done validated every promise that advisors had ever made about standing with the indigenous forces. It also set an impossible standard that would make future betrayals even more painful when they inevitably occurred. The Australian command faced a bureaucratic dilemma that perfectly illustrated the gap between military regulations and moral reality. Keith Payne had received a direct order to withdraw to the main compound. He had acknowledged that order, and then he had deliberately chosen to ignore it, remaining in hostile territory for 5+ hours while conducting rescue operations that had no authorization from his chain of command. By the letter of military law, this was insubordination, a court-martial offense that could end a career and result in criminal punishment. The fact that his disobedience had saved 40 lives was irrelevant from a purely legal standpoint. Orders existed to be followed, and allowing soldiers to pick and choose which orders they obeyed based on personal moral calculations was a recipe for the breakdown of military discipline. If every warrant officer could decide that their judgment superseded their commander's orders, the entire system of military hierarchy would collapse into chaos. These were not trivial concerns or bureaucratic nitpicking. They were fundamental questions about how militaries function and whether individual moral courage could be reconciled with institutional requirements for obedience. The investigation into Payne's actions was conducted with the understanding that the outcome would set a precedent that would reverberate throughout the Australian military and potentially influence how advisors operated for the rest of the war. Evidence was gathered from multiple sources: the survivors who Payne had rescued, other Australian advisors who had witnessed parts of the operation, American personnel at Ben Het who could testify to the tactical situation and the condition of Payne when he returned, and Payne himself, who provided a characteristically blunt account of his reasoning and actions. The testimonies painted a picture that was impossible to reduce to simple legal categories. Yes, Payne had disobeyed an order, but he had done so in order to save the lives of soldiers who would almost certainly have died if he had followed that order. His actions had required extraordinary physical courage, sustained over hours, with no expectation of recognition or reward. He had achieved results that were tactically significant, bringing back a substantial portion of the battalion's survivors and demonstrating to the Montagnards that at least some advisors meant what they said about loyalty and shared sacrifice. The military bureaucracy found itself facing a choice between two competing values: the importance of maintaining discipline and the chain of command versus the recognition that moral courage sometimes requires violating orders in service of a higher principle. The fact that Payne's disobedience had undeniably saved lives made the case different from typical insubordination. If the order he had disobeyed had been strategically important, if his actions had endangered other operations or soldiers, the calculation might have been different. But the order to withdraw had been about preserving Payne's life, and Payne had made a conscious choice that 40 other lives were more important than his own safety. That was not a choice that military regulations knew how to process, because it violated the implicit assumption that self-preservation is a basic human instinct that doesn't need to be explicitly authorized or forbidden. The recommendation that emerged from the investigation was as unprecedented as Payne's actions had been. Rather than courts-martial and punishment, the Australian military recommended that Warrant Officer Keith Payne be awarded the Victoria Cross, Australia's highest military decoration for valor in the presence of the enemy. The VC is not a participation trophy or a routine recognition. It is reserved for acts of conspicuous gallantry in the face of extreme danger, actions that define heroism in its most pure form. Only 100 Australians had received the Victoria Cross in the entire history of the decoration, spanning 2 world wars and numerous smaller conflicts. For the military to not only decline to punish Payne's disobedience, but to grant him the nation's highest honor, was a statement that institutional values sometimes had to bend before moral clarity. The choice sent multiple messages simultaneously: that advisors who stood by their indigenous allies would be supported rather than punished, that moral courage could override strict obedience in extreme circumstances, and that the Australian military valued soldiers who would risk everything to save their men. On October 8, 1969, less than 5 months after the events in the jungle near Ben Het, the award of the Victoria Cross to Warrant Officer Keith Payne was officially announced. The citation specifically recognized his actions on May 24th, noting his refusal to withdraw, his repeated trips into enemy-controlled territory to rescue wounded soldiers, and his successful leadership in bringing approximately 40 men to safety through several kilometers of hostile jungle. The language was formal and understated in the way that military citations typically are, but the significance was unmistakable. The Australian government was declaring that Keith Payne had not just met, but exceeded the highest standards of military valor, that his actions represented heroism worthy of emulation. For Payne himself, the recognition was reportedly received with characteristic humility. He had not conducted the rescue operation with the expectation of medals or glory. He had done it because abandoning wounded soldiers was something he personally could not accept, and the award did not change that basic moral calculus. The Victoria Cross made Keith Payne a national figure in Australia, one of only 4 members of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam to receive the decoration, and one of a tiny number of living VC recipients in the country. But the broader implications of his actions and the military's response were largely ignored by the strategic planners and policymakers who should have been paying attention. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam had demonstrated repeatedly and at significant cost that the advisory approach of embedding highly skilled soldiers with indigenous forces, supporting them through shared hardship, and leading by example, produced results far out of proportion to the resources invested. The team never exceeded 120 personnel. It operated on a budget that was a rounding error compared to American expenditures in Vietnam. And yet, it had achieved tactical successes that made conventional American operations look wasteful and ineffective by comparison. The 4 Victoria Crosses awarded to AATTV members represented a concentration of recognized heroism that was unprecedented for a unit of that size. The 50% casualty rate demonstrated both the dangers of the mission and the fact that the advisors were genuinely sharing the risks they asked indigenous soldiers to take. The lesson should have been obvious. Small, highly trained advisory teams that built genuine relationships with local forces were more effective at counterinsurgency than massive conventional formations that fought the war as if it were a repeat of World War II with helicopters. But learning that lesson would have required a fundamental rethinking of American strategy, acknowledgement that the entire approach of fighting a war of attrition through overwhelming firepower was not just ineffective, but actively counterproductive. It would have meant reducing the massive logistics bases, cutting the defense contracts for conventional weapon systems, and shifting resources to special operations and advisory efforts that did not produce impressive statistics about bomb tonnage and body counts. Institutional bureaucracies do not make those changes easily, especially in the middle of a war where careers and budgets are invested in the current approach. So the lesson was noted, filed away in after-action reports that few people read, and essentially ignored by the planners who continued to pursue strategies that prioritized conventional operations over the patient, culturally intelligent advisory work that men like Keith Payne had proven could be effective. The Montagnard soldiers who fought alongside Australian advisors in the Central Highlands faced a future that made their sacrifices seem particularly cruel in retrospect. When the United States withdrew combat forces from Vietnam in 1973 and South Vietnam finally collapsed in 1975, the Montagnards were abandoned to a fate that anyone with basic knowledge of communist revolutionary doctrine could have predicted. The new Vietnamese government viewed the Highland peoples with suspicion and hostility, seeing them as collaborators who had fought for the losing side and who represented a potential security threat. Montagnard leaders were arrested, imprisoned, or executed. Communities were forcibly relocated from their ancestral lands. Cultural practices were suppressed. The promise that had been made to the Montagnards, that fighting alongside American and Allied forces would secure their future and protect their way of life, turned out to be a lie. Thousands died in re-education camps or were killed during forced relocations. Some managed to escape to Thailand and eventually resettled as refugees in the United States, Australia, and other countries. But the majority were trapped in Vietnam, subject to decades of persecution that continues in more subtle forms even today. This long-term betrayal adds bitter context to Keith Payne's rescue operation. He saved 40 soldiers on May 24, 1969, giving them the gift of continued life and the opportunity to return to their families. But that gift came with the knowledge that their ultimate fate and the fate of their people would be decided by strategic calculations that treated indigenous allies as disposable assets to be used and then abandoned when convenient. The Australian advisors who served with the AATTV were aware of this dynamic, even while the war was ongoing. They knew that promises made to the Montagnards about protection and support after the war were likely to be broken. They knew that the soldiers they trained and fought beside were being set up for eventual betrayal. But they also knew that individual relationships and small-scale tactical success were the only things they could control, and that doing the right thing in the moment mattered, even if the strategic situation was fundamentally flawed. This moral compartmentalization, where you focus on the mission in front of you rather than the larger catastrophe you're contributing to, is a psychological necessity that allows soldiers to function in wars where the overall strategy makes no sense. By the time the United States completed its withdrawal from Vietnam and the Saigon government collapsed in 1975, Keith Payne had moved on to other assignments and would eventually retire from the Australian Army after decades of service. But the events of May 24, 1969, remained the defining moment of his military career. The actions that would be his legacy long after the institutional memory of the Vietnam War faded from public consciousness. The Victoria Cross ensured that his story would be taught in military academies and leadership courses, analyzed as a case study in moral courage under impossible circumstances. But the broader lesson about effective counterinsurgency and the value of advisor operations embedded in Payne's success continued to be a hard sell for militaries that preferred the clarity and simplicity of conventional warfare to the messy complexity of building relationships with indigenous forces. The decades following the Vietnam War saw the Australian Special Operations community and advisory traditions continue to evolve, informed by, but not limited to, the lessons of the AATTV experience. Small unit excellence and cultural intelligence that Keith Payne exemplified became core principles in Special Forces training, even as conventional forces often struggled to integrate those principles into their doctrine and operations. When Australia deployed forces to Afghanistan and Iraq in support of American-led operations against terrorism and insurgency, the shadow of Vietnam hung over the advisory missions that once again required Western soldiers to embed with indigenous forces and attempt to build combat-effective units capable of providing their own security. The parallels were sometimes uncomfortable. Foreign advisors working with local forces of questionable reliability in complex cultural environments where the host nation government was often corrupt or ineffective. Indigenous soldiers who formed personal loyalties to individual advisors, but had limited faith in their own chain of command. Strategic objectives that shifted with political wins in distant capitals, while soldiers on the ground tried to accomplish tactical missions that made sense in the moment, but might not matter in the long term. The parallels became even more pointed in August of 2021, when American and Allied forces withdrew from Afghanistan in a chaotic evacuation that left thousands of Afghan interpreters, soldiers, and civilians who had worked with coalition forces at the mercy of the Taliban. The images of desperate Afghans trying to board evacuation flights, the reports of Taliban reprisals against people who had collaborated with foreign forces, and the political debate about moral obligations to local allies who had risked everything to support Western operations, all echoed the Montagnard experience from 5 decades earlier. Military veterans who had served as advisors in Afghanistan explicitly drew comparisons to Vietnam, arguing that abandoning indigenous allies who had trusted foreign promises was not just a strategic failure, but a moral catastrophe that would make future advisory operations nearly impossible. Keith Payne's example from May of 1969 was cited in articles and social media posts as a counterexample to institutional betrayal. a demonstration that individual soldiers could choose to honor their commitments to local allies, even when strategic policy dictated abandonment. The enduring relevance of Payne's actions speaks to the fact that the fundamental questions about military ethics and advisor operations have not been resolved despite decades of experience and debate. When is it appropriate for a soldier to disobey orders based on moral conviction? What obligations do militaries have to indigenous forces who fight alongside them? How do you balance strategic necessity against the commitments made to individuals who trusted you with their lives? These are not abstract philosophical questions. They are practical dilemmas that advisors face in combat zones around the world, where the gap between institutional policy and ground-level reality can be measured in lives lost or saved. Keith Payne answered those questions on May 24, 1969, with his actions rather than his words. He determined that 40 lives were worth risking his own, that moral clarity mattered more than career preservation, and that the soldiers under his care deserved the same loyalty they had shown him. The Victoria Cross validated that choice at the institutional level, creating a precedent that individual moral courage could override orders when the stakes were high enough and the cause was just. But precedents are only useful if institutions actually learn from them and incorporate the lessons into doctrine and training, rather than treating them as isolated cases of individual heroism. The evidence from subsequent conflicts suggests that the lesson of Keith Payne and the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam has been partially learned at the tactical level, where Special Operations Forces and advisory units train extensively in cultural awareness, language skills, and relationship building that creates trust with indigenous forces. But at the strategic level, where choices about troop deployments, resource allocation, and long-term commitments are made, the tendency toward conventional thinking and the preference for measurable metrics over nuanced relationship management continues to dominate. Militaries still struggle with the fundamental tension between treating local forces as genuine partners versus viewing them as convenient auxiliaries to be used and discarded as strategic priorities shift. Keith Payne is still alive as of 2024, 91 years old and living in Queensland, Australia. He is one of the few remaining Victoria Cross recipients from the Vietnam War era, a living connection to events that are now being studied as history by military personnel who were not born until decades after the battles in the Central Highlands. His continued presence serves as a reminder that the questions raised by his actions on May 24, 1969, are not historical curiosities, but ongoing challenges that every generation of soldiers must confront anew. When do you follow orders, and when do you follow your conscience? What do you owe to the soldiers who trust you with their lives? How do you maintain your humanity in situations where the institutional logic suggests that survival and mission accomplishment require you to become someone you would not want to be? These are questions that military ethics courses can discuss but cannot definitively answer, because the answers depend on individual judgment in specific circumstances that can never be fully captured in doctrine or training scenarios. The 40 Montagnard soldiers who Keith Payne rescued on May 24, 1969, went on to have lives and families because of his choice to stay when he was ordered to leave. Some of them survived the war and the difficult years that followed. Some undoubtedly died in the fighting that continued for another 6 years after Payne's rescue operation. The exact fates of individual soldiers are lost to the incomplete records of indigenous units and the chaos of the war's final years. But the broader truth is that those men got to see another sunrise, got to hold their families one more time, got to live whatever years remained to them, because one Australian warrant officer determined that their lives mattered more than his own safety or his military career. That is simple. Fundamental moral clarity that is easy to admire in retrospect, and incredibly difficult to maintain when you are the one making the choice with incomplete information and mortal danger pressing in from all sides. The comparison between Keith Payne's 5 hours in the jungle and the broader American strategy in Vietnam illuminates a truth that military institutions have always struggled to accept. Bigger is not always better. More firepower does not automatically translate to more effectiveness. The most expensive approach is not necessarily the most successful. One warrant officer with no resources beyond his own skill, courage, and physical endurance achieved a tactical success that entire battalions with millions of dollars of equipment failed to accomplish. He did it through understanding the soldiers he worked with, through building relationships based on shared sacrifice, through cultural intelligence that recognized the Montagnards would only fight effectively for leaders they trusted, and through moral courage that refused to accept the easy path of abandoning men who were inconvenient to save. These are lessons that Special Operations Forces understand and incorporate into their training. But conventional militaries, with their emphasis on mass, firepower, and industrial-scale logistics, continue to struggle with the idea that some problems cannot be solved by throwing more resources at them. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam proved repeatedly that small teams of highly skilled advisors could achieve results that massive conventional operations could not. They did it at a fraction of the cost, and with a casualty rate that, while horrific in percentage terms, was tiny in absolute numbers compared to American losses. The 4 Victoria Crosses awarded to AATTV members were a testament to both the effectiveness of their approach and the extreme danger they operated in. But the broader strategic lesson that their success illustrated, that counterinsurgency is fundamentally about building relationships and earning trust, rather than destroying enemies through overwhelming force, was never fully absorbed by the military establishments that should have been learning from their example. Instead, the AATTV experience was filed away as an interesting case study, admired but not emulated at the scale that might have changed the war's outcome. Keith Payne's 5 hours in the jungle answered every question about effective counterinsurgency that military strategists had been asking for decades. The solution to building reliable indigenous forces was not better equipment or more training, but rather embedding advisors who were willing to share every danger and who demonstrated through their actions that they would never abandon the soldiers they led. The most important factor in advisory operations was not tactical skill or technical knowledge, but moral courage that indigenous soldiers could observe and trust. These are uncomfortable questions for military bureaucracies because the answers do not scale well. You can manufacture weapons and equipment in vast quantities. You can deploy tens of thousands of conventional soldiers, but you cannot mass produce Keith Payne's. The qualities that allowed him to make the choice he made on May 24th, 1969, and to sustain the physical and psychological effort required to rescue 40 soldiers over 5+ hours are not the result of training programs or doctrine development. They are the product of character, formed over a lifetime of experiences and choices that cannot be replicated through institutional processes. The story of Keith Payne and the soldiers he saved is not about perfect strategy or flawless execution. It is a story about what one person can accomplish when institutional failure creates a vacuum that individual moral courage must fill. The strategic situation that put the 212th Battalion in an untenable position was a systemic failure of planning, resource allocation, and political calculation. The order for advisors to withdraw that Payne disobeyed was entirely reasonable from a strategic perspective that valued advisor lives as more important than indigenous soldiers who could be replaced. The entire architecture of the war was based on assumptions about what mattered and what could be sacrificed that treated Montagnard lives as less valuable than American or Australian lives. Keith Payne rejected that calculation, not through political protest or ideological argument, but through the simple act of staying when he was told to leave and working until he could barely stand to save as many soldiers as physically possible. That rejection of the hierarchy of value that the war imposed created a moment of moral clarity that 5 decades of subsequent analysis and debate have not diminished. 5 hours in the jungle, 40 men saved, 1 Victoria Cross, and a question that will never be settled. Are you someone who follows the order to withdraw and preserve yourself, accepting that good soldiers will die because you chose safety? Or are you someone who determines that some things matter more than your own survival and acts on that regardless of the cost? Keith Payne answered that question on May 24, 1969. The Australian military validated his answer with their highest honor, and every soldier who has served as an advisor since then has had to confront the same question in their own way, knowing that the institutional support for moral courage is never guaranteed, and that the right answer might cost everything. The 40 Montagnard soldiers who walked out of the jungle behind Keith Payne got to live because one man determined the math of institutional strategy was wrong. One conscience against an entire military system's logic about acceptable losses. And the conscience won, at least for those 5 hours, for those 40 lives, in that small piece of jungle where the rules got rewritten by someone who refused to follow them.